Okay, Giant team members, in this video lecture, we're going to look at some of those things that are generally excluded in most communication models, but are very important when we're talking about change communication. Those three things are gender, power, and emotion. And we're going to take a little time with each one and talk about, number one, some of the subtle differences between communication between genders or between the genders at work. We're going to look at power and how that influences communication and how that could really have an impact on the change initiative. And then one that really is generally ignored in most communication models, but from what we learned in class number 2, emotions play a powerful role in how we view the world and what we remember and our general attitude about something. So it's important that when and change is a very emotional process. A lot of times people are afraid, they're anxious, they're stressed, they're excited. So to not consider emotion at all when we're talking about change, I think is a bit of a misgiving and a bit of a mistake. Probably especially to those with that directive image or directive perspective on change. So let's look, in this video lecture, we'll look at each of those, we'll talk a little bit about each of those, and we'll put each of them in the context of change. So certainly gender differences impact the communication process, and I think if you've been alive on this planet, we know that males and females tend to communicate in different ways. Most male communication has more confidence and boasting in it, whereas females tend to ask more questions. And unfortunately, sometimes asking questions can be seen as a sign of weakness or a sign of not being well informed, of not being intelligent. And that is certainly not the case. That is not the case. But again, we're talking about perceptions in the workplace, and your book really gets into a good discussion about alpha males, right? These individuals that tend to dominate, and they're not taking feelings into consideration, and they're very quick to decisions and judgments. And so asking questions is, hey, look, there's no time for questions, or why aren't you prepared? Why are you asking questions? So that's still viewed in a somewhat negative way within an organization, which baffles me, because I think the clearer we are, the less ambiguous we are, the more probability of success. But again, how our workplace functions today, maybe it might be different 10 or 15 years from now, but this is kind of what we're dealing with today. Males tend to use the I. I hired this, I initiated this, and I'm going to go ahead and do this, versus female, who's speaking tends to be in the we. We are going to undertake this project. We are going to add a new computer system. So that just the language in which, or the way that males tend to view their role in the organization, maybe in a little more confident or dominant fashion than more of the we. Your book talks about some steps to help women become more comfortable in a still male-dominated setting, and the work environment is still mostly male. That's changing. That is changing rapidly, and again, who knows, 10, 15 years from now. But to help women a little bit, lay some groundwork, master the pre-meeting, meaning, most males tend to show up a little early, lay some groundwork for the meeting, stay after the meeting, and maybe do some politicizing, some discussing about elements that was talked about in the meeting. So I think females need to kind of master that. I don't think this is what your book is saying. Females need to kind of lay that groundwork for arriving early and maybe leaving a little later. Prepare to speak spontaneously, and that's an oxymoron, right? How do you prepare to speak off the cuff? And that's kind of women prefer the more formal presentations. Men don't necessarily like that, but women can be prepared to speak spontaneously with some talking points or some key points or commentary prior going to the meeting. So it might seem a little off the cuff. Hey, I have a comment, I have a question, I have something I need to bring up, and it might seem off the cuff and spontaneous, but it was really thought out beforehand, which is good because, again, the female prefers the more formal presentation, there it is, versus the male who's more kind of spontaneous and off the cuff and generates these comments as they're going through. The last one is emotional control, and again, your book says oftentimes passion is, if a female exhibits passion, it's viewed as emotional. They're being emotional. They're not being passionate about it, but they're just being emotional. Which again, I feel is unfortunate because there seems to be a different set of standards between the males and females oftentimes in the more male-dominated work environment. So just be aware, maybe the manner in which someone is speaking, the inflections, just the tone of their voice could lead someone to believe, oh, that person's emotional. If I'm speaking louder versus softer, oh, they're emotional. They're getting emotional about it. Versus, hey, I'm just passionate about this project. And you're seeing that passion, but you're misinterpreting it as emotion. So that's just something to kind of be aware of when you're at meetings or team settings or something like that. Again, I think these things have changed and are changing as we go along, as more females enter the workforce. Now, who knows what will happen post-COVID, but as more females are in the workforce and you're getting more of a balance and you're getting females in positions of power and higher up within organizations, you won't see these male-dominated type meetings or team meetings where, you almost have to walk on eggshells a little bit or conform to what the norm is there. Because I don't see anything wrong with asking questions. I don't see anything wrong with being passionate about a topic. It's just the way that its perceptions and how things are being interpreted. Some other differences between males and females: the feedback, the way males and females give feedback is different. The way they complement each other is definitely different, and the direct versus the indirect communication is different. So, just within genders in an organization, forgetting change management, you have these differences in communication that could be interpreted and or be perceived in certain ways. Then we have power, and power differences are usually barriers to communication. We're talking about power differences. We're saying, this person is in a position of power and has subordinates versus maybe somebody who's at a more subordinate level and really doesn't hold any power within the organization. That could cause barriers to communication. For example, those in power may not want to disclose information because they're afraid that maybe they're not going to hold on to their power, or by giving information they're going to lose some of their power. And those not in power may not share information because they don't want it used against them. Maybe something had gone wrong and there was a small hiccup along the way and they don't want to share that information because, hey, maybe it's going to be used against me. So you have this dynamic where the sharing of information is critical, especially in change projects, but those in power may not want to share it, those not in power may not want to share it for almost opposite reasons. So, be aware of that. Be aware of those power differentials within the organization, within your organization, and make sure that you try to make sharing, especially sharing of information, very commonplace. There are power tells of dominant versus submissive individuals. This is on page 219 of your textbook. Power tells of dominant individuals sitting and standing with legs far apart in an open posture. So dominant individuals will make themselves wider, and their legs will be spread, and their arms will be on their waist, and they're spreading out. It's a very dominant position. They'll use invasive hand gestures when they're talking to you. They'll smile less because smiling is an appeasement. I'm appeasing to you if I smile. So whatever I'm saying, whatever you're saying, I'm saying, okay, I agree with what I'm smiling. So you may not have as much of that smiling. Establishing. I had trouble with that in another lesson too. Establishing visual dominance by looking away from someone as they're talking. So if you're talking to me, I am going to be looking away from you, which is certainly a sign of power, and implying that I really don't need to be attentive to you. I mean, maybe I am listening, but I'm implying that I don't need to. Speaking first, using a lower vocal register. If I'm talking a little deeper, and that is a sign that's a dominant sign that people use, and they're more likely to interrupt other people when they're talking. Those are all, and you know people like that. I'm sure you work with people like that who have these dominant gestures and the way of speaking and looking and not looking at you. So you can be aware of those. And then some of the tells of more submissive individuals, they modify their speech to sound more like the person, and they modify their gestures to match more of the person they're talking to. I think we talked about this in a previous class. And be aware of it, because you'll see that if you're talking to somebody for an extended period of time, sometimes you're both matching, what the other person is doing as they're speaking. That's a bit of sign of a submissive individual. Frequent hesitations, adopting a closed posture, really closing yourself down. Clasping your hands, touching your face, touching your hair are all submissive gestures. Blushing, coughing, dry mouth, heavy breathing, heavy swallowing, all of those are signs of submissive individuals. So again, be aware of those signs too, because you may not be aware that somebody feels that way, or that somebody might be not sharing information because they feel more submissive, or they feel dominant. The last one we're going to talk about is emotion, because most change communication models focus on the cognitive and the rational part of thinking, right? That system 2 part that we talked about in class number 1 and probably class number 2, the cognitive part, thinking, planning, predicting, decision making, all of that. But we know that emotion plays a big part in communication. Emotional appeals communicate vision and urgency to people. So when we have that change communication, we do need to communicate vision and urgency. And if we use emotion, that really conveys that urgency and that vision. Positive emotions generate excitement and anticipation. And Table 7.2 in your book goes through and talks about how to get emotional commitment on change. From the core message, having emotional arguments and metaphors, you're going to paint a picture using metaphors. The phoenix rising from the ashes it presents a visualization and maybe some kind of an emotional appeal. To the way you package the message with humor and maybe displaying emotion. The setting, group dynamics, the ceremonies, the atmosphere, all of those things can inject emotion into that change communication, which again is important because you want to generate some excitement and some anticipation about the change project. You can't just do that by telling. Employees perceive change will be personally harmful. That can cause negative emotions, obviously, right? And most people view change as being somewhat personally harmful. So managers should take the perspective of the individuals they're talking to, be empathetic, understand why they may be anxious and stressed about change. They should have threat-reducing behavior, intentional interpersonal interactions, one-on-one interactions with with people. That reduces the threat. And then some reflection, some self-evaluation about how was that communication process? Did I miss the point? Was I ambiguous? Was I fuzzy? Did I give them too much information? There's a lot of that should be going on with change agents. And then, can change managers really generate positive emotional response? So there's a lot of people that will say, you know, in theory that's good, but can they really do it? Number one, there's a lot of external factors out there that could inhibit positive emotion and positive emotions towards change projects. We're coming to work with a lot of baggage, so that might hinder our ability to enact change. Not everybody responds the same way to emotional stimuli. Some people get very excited, some people just kind of blow it off. So we're dealing with a large number of people in an organization. I don't know if I can impact them all the same way. Not all managers have the skills or credibility to manage emotional responses. So some managers are just a little more stoic, a little more matter of fact, a little less emotional or empathetic. So not all managers can generate that, have the skills and the credibility to do that. And then some changes, it's easy to elicit in mind. We're a new project, we have the new product coming out, this is going to be awesome, versus some more routine change, which may be hard to elicit some positive response or positive emotion. Okay, so that's our discussion on really the three elements that aren't discussed a lot in communication models. The differences between genders, the influence of power on communication, both in a positive and negative way, and then lastly, emotion and the role that emotion plays in the change process, and can managers really manage that emotional component.